Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today, our guest is Joe Silva. I'm very happy to have you here today, Joe. Welcome.
Thanks, Ajay. It's good to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Likewise. I know who you are roughly, but can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. So I am the co-founder and CEO of Spektion. We're a cybersecurity company with a product that does something pretty unique in terms of how we leverage runtime behavior analysis to understand vulnerability risk in software. So organizations can get a better handle on what it is, how they can manage it and prioritize it kind of within the scope of everything that they actually can do in terms of all the tools they already have on hand. This was a persistent problem that I dealt with in previous jobs. My co-founders and I saw a real opportunity to do something to solve it. Um, Previously, I had been the global CISO at JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, which is one of the world's largest commercial real estate companies. And then prior to that, I led cybersecurity at TransUnion, which is a large international credit bureau.
Sounds very, very extensive, and I'm very excited to have
Hmm.
this, insightful conversation with you. Yeah, I know that we are talking about vulnerability management today in a, general sense, at least under this umbrella. But I would say let's get into it. Let's get into, the deep parts of it. What are we exactly talking about today?
Yeah. So I think when we talk about vulnerability management and cybersecurity, I think we're typically very conditioned in the industry to think about things that are CVE based, right? So the common vulnerability enumerator, the system we have for publishing discovered vulnerabilities. At Spaction, we recognized, having spent, my co-founders and I spent our careers in various facets of discovering and managing vulnerabilities that the CVE-based system, very well intentioned, very helpful, but is a really static approach to addressing, an issue that is like among the top risk vectors for every large organization. Kind of antiquated when you think about the fact that we're leveraging runtime solutions in all these other areas of cybersecurity, threat management, et cetera. I would say we're almost in the antivirus era of, 15, 20 years ago for how we handle vulnerability management via CVEs. And to a large extent, like the CVE ecosystem, when you're running a vulnerability management program of addressing, vulnerabilities in software that are commercial, so there's overlap with third-party risks, open source software adoption, as well as internally developed software, whether it's things that you're producing for your customers or increasingly software that's just being built internally for internal use cases. Uh, the CVE-based ecosystem and that data is both overwhelming. The amount of CVEs that are high severity that teams are dealing with is only increasing. And yet it's also insufficient to kind of cover the full span of risk that you need to worry about. And so we built Spection around vulnerabilities in the context of all risks that relate to exploitability, not just those that are captured in CVEs. And so we do that by we see the software, we examine its behavior and runtime. We're able to identify factors that relate to the likelihood and or kind of blast radius of exploitation. We marry that up with CVE data where it's available to provide the fullest possible view into the risk associated with all the software that you may be running on your systems, to include how you can leverage the controls that you already have on hand, whether it's your EDR, XDR, SIEM. We integrate into those because I had a real frustration where uh, my peers in IT who were responsible for maintaining software, they were going above and beyond continuously, doing the best they possibly could to keep up with all the vulnerabilities that my team was reporting to them. They could never do enough. And the residual risk was very difficult to manage in a targeted way with all the tools that we had on hand. And my co-founders and I recognized that there was a real data problem. We didn't have the data we needed to understand how could we focus, for example, our EDR on specifically addressing, the initial exploitation of some of these risks. And so when we obtained the runtime data, we were able to build out custom mechanisms that we could integrate into security tools. We also went ahead and identified just typical IT hardening guidance that isn't always implemented and sometimes can't be implemented depending on the nature of the organization, but at least provide some optionality rather than just waiting for a patch to be available or deploying a patch quickly because every enterprise IT organization is kind of just exhausted from vulnerability patching fire drills. So we kind of wanted to help organizations be proactive, kind of take back some of the control around risk associated with software vulnerabilities.
Thank you. And let's, for our audience, let's say they may be CISOs, they might be risk managers, and so on. When they are managing, the vulnerability or, risk or cybersecurity related things, what should be the key things that they should be really, like looking for? What should be things they should start, taking actionable points on like right away in your experience or how you
Yeah.
observe? How would you
Yeah. I
say?
mean, ultimately, when you're trying to understand just, software vulnerability risk, it's kind of at the base of it is understanding what is actually in your environment and running. And increasingly, we find that, organizations recognize they have an issue with software sprawl. Like the software ecosystem is, increasingly, I would say, like atomized. Uh, AI is, I think, accelerating that because it's enabling folks who wouldn't typically be writing software to write their own software for internal use. So it's a lot harder to actually understand all the software on your systems. But a foundation and visibility in the software, ideally, organizations would understand what that software is used for, by whom, the sensitivity of the operations. But the reality is, like inventory is like one of the most persistent problems that anybody sees in cybersecurity. So any solution is going to have to it's going to have to work in the absence of an ideal inventory and context around use. Ideally, you would have it. The next step would then be to understand, and this is where we identified that we could deliver some unique value around this data, is to say, what is the software actually doing, right? What is it accessing at a technical level in terms of what is its behavior, what level of privilege is it running at, what functions is it executing against, uh, what behavior is it displaying that would indicate that it is likely going to be susceptible to exploitation or some type of code execution vulnerability. What behavior is it displaying to show that if exploited, uh, it's already displayed behavior that's going to say, hey, the impact of this software being exploited is much greater than another piece of software that may be similarly vulnerable. So what we recognize is inventory fluctuates based on organizational practices, constraints, IT governance is an ongoing challenge for everyone. But the runtime behavior of software in the organization is absolutely knowable. And with that information, provides a lot of power in terms of how you can prioritize vulnerability remediation, how you can implement targeted mitigations at scale, and how you can overall kind of increase the efficacy of your program. I mean, my experience in talking with my peers has been that like help is not on the way with vulnerability management in terms of new resources, right? Nobody's going to get significantly larger teams to help manage vulnerabilities. And even if they did, the manual effort isn't going to scale, especially manual efforts that are built on CVE data that is a best effort, but is increasingly showing signs of strain as an ecosystem for capturing software risk. So new solutions that bring in new data are going to be needed to improve the efficacy of these processes, because it's not just about doing better, it's about doing better and being more efficient. Because ultimately, as people like adopt some of the practices I mentioned and you look to increase your visibility, you're only going to find more problems, right? And if you're a risk manager, a CISO, another security executive, the last thing you're looking for is just more problems. You've already got enough on your plate. So the efficacy at which you can kind of address them at scale in a way that's relatively low friction for the technology organization is going to be key.
Thank you for that insight as well. And with that, I'm actually done with my, like general questions.
Okay.
So is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I just this, I appreciate the opportunity to be on. And, you know, there the founding of Spektion grew out of a lot of frustration from my co-founders and I. We recognized that we were working on and with teams that were going above and beyond many instances, working as hard as they could, we were spending, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on tools to help with this problem, and nothing was getting any better. I've not seen any kind of typical business process or function in cybersecurity that is higher investment, lower risk reduction than vulnerability management. We've become amazing at articulating, capturing, and reporting the problem, but our ability to address the problem and introduce predictable processes and risk reduction has really not kept pace with that. And so that's why we built Spection, because we just refused to believe that this was the world we had to live in cybersecurity, where the current practices for vulnerability management were the best we could do. And so we realized to do that, we kind of had to break outside the paradigm of solely relying on CVE data and derivative analysis and expand it to address the expansion of software, which again, you see it all over the place with AI is only going to get worse. So that's essentially, why we're here. I know we're solving this problem for some customers early on. I'm really happy to bring it to a bigger audience.
Absolutely. So, well, we are also very happy to have you again here. So, yeah, that was it on my end. So, I want to thank you so much, Joe, for, joining us today, sharing, your perspective on this, your expertise on this, and yeah, everything. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Edge. It was very nice talking to you. Pleasure to be on.
Likewise.